So we'll get started here at the last session of the CSERP conference. We're very pleased today to have Michael Sinkinson from the Yale School of Management. You can see he'll be talking about recent advances in media economics, media as an input to democracy. Dr. Sinkinson is currently an assistant professor at the Yale School of Management. He's also a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER, and he does have some Pennsylvania roots. He spent some time at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania before moving to Yale. His PhD is from Harvard University, actually comes originally from Canada. So he has his bachelor's from Queen's University in Ontario. He also has practical experience. He spent a couple of years as a market analyst. His main research areas are applied micro and what in economics we call industrial organization, which this would be related to, he's done work on competition in media, how that affects media coverage of politics and politics in general. He's currently working on issues in firm entry and drug pricing, so extremely important issues. And he was in 2014 Poets and Quants, which is one of the biggest websites looking at business education, awarded him one of the year outstanding 40 business school professors under 40 years old. I think you still hold that title, and will continue to hold it for a couple more years. All right, so we're very happy to have Michael Sinkinson. Thank you for coming, and Michael, take it away.
Thank you all for being here. I'm going to try and go without a microphone, so just let me know if you can't hear anything. But yeah, so thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. It's been a really fun conference so far. I've enjoyed how it's very interdisciplinary. And so my plan for my time today is to do the following. I have kind of 3 parts that I want to cover. First, again, because this is such an interdisciplinary group, I want to tell you a bit about what economists are working on in the space kind of related to this conference when it comes to the media and how it intersects with democracy. Okay, so economists have been really interested in questions around how the media interacts with democracy, and so I'm going to spend the first part of the talk going over some recent kind of facts that we've established in the literature. And as I go through that, given that the room here, I think most people thinking maybe about a senior thesis, if you have questions about the research methods as I describe them, you should ask as we go along. Okay. Then I'm going to talk about a current project that I'm working on, where we're trying to understand how the business model of the newspaper responds to new technologies. Okay, and as we'll see today, obviously there's lots of new technology in the news space. I'm going to show you results from a historical context, how newspapers respond to the entry of television. But as I'll show you, we can actually learn a lot about what's going on today from how the business model evolved from that change. And then the third thing I want to talk about is I want to show you some raw data from a new project I'm working on. So I've been collecting raw data on a huge panel of US daily newspapers over a long time horizon. So we're trying to document what's going on with newspapers. There's a bit of a, if you read the writing on this, there's a crisis going on with local newspapers. We're losing local newspapers. So in this project, what our goal is to actually estimate what economists call a production function for the news media. Okay, and so we're gathering a huge data set, and towards the end of the talk, I want to show you some of the raw data on what's going on with newspapers in this country. Okay. All right, so let's begin by thinking about how are economists studying the news media and how it affects democracy. So I want to talk about a few different papers that have made a big splash in this literature. The first is one that tries to examine what kind of news do people want to read, and what news do you personally want to read. And the way they're getting at this is by studying the actual language used to report the news. Okay, so this paper by Jen Scow and Shapiro, they had a very clever idea. They took the US congressional record, which if you don't know, that's basically a transcript of the floor of Congress. Okay? They look at who's speaking, and they look at the language those people use. Okay, and they figure out from this raw data, what are the most partisan phrases that are used in debating an issue. Okay, so I have some classic examples. Republicans would refer to a death tax, whereas Democrats would say it's an estate tax. Democrats would say it's the war in Iraq, Republicans would say it's the war on terror. Okay, and so they were able to extract this from the congressional record. Well, they then just turned around and said, we have all the news articles that are reported in daily newspapers. We have databases. So let's figure out how newspapers choose to report on these topics. Do they call it the estate tax, or do they call it the death tax? Do they call it the war in Iraq or the war on terror? What they were able to do is come up with what they called a slant score for over 400 daily newspapers in the US. Some were definitely no surprise. It turns out the Washington Post was more Democratic speaking, and the Washington Times was more Republican speaking. Okay, so it checked out. So they got these scores for every newspaper in the US. They then kind of exploited a cool fact, which is if you're a newspaper, you're going to pick how you report the news, but you pick it for the entire market you're in. So they went further and they looked in zip codes, how do newspapers circulate and how do political contributions look? And what they found is in areas that are contributing to Republicans, they subscribe to the Republican paper, and in areas that donate to the Democrats, they subscribe to the Democrat paper. Okay, and they're able to get an elasticity with respect to slant. How does my demand for this paper reflect the way the news is reported in this paper? Okay, so this is really a big deal. What they found, a couple of other nice findings, was that first of all, firms tend to choose the profit maximizing slant. So if you're starting a newspaper in Lancaster, what they would see is that, oh, the way the news is reported is the way people on average would want to see it reported in this market. The good news about that is that it means that ownership doesn't matter too much. If the New York Times started a paper in South Carolina, it wouldn't look like the New York Times. It would look like what the market in South Carolina wants. Okay, so if ownership doesn't matter, that's good. Bad news is we're giving people what they want. Right? In some sense, you might prefer an objective standard to reporting the news. Okay, so the concern that this raises is the idea of echo chambers in the long run. People only reading news they want to read. If you notice, this paper was published in 2008. They estimated in 2004. It really did kind of predict a lot of things that happened. Right? Because after 2004, the cost of starting a newspaper, well, an online one was very low. The cost of content was quite low. The cost of distribution was very low. So it turned out to be profit maximizing to produce a lot of very particular news websites that cater to particular political preferences. Okay? So just to be clear, if you look at the paper, you can actually look at the words that come out of congressional record as being the most partisan. And it really does seem to make a lot of kind of common sense. For example, the Democrats, they were talking about private accounts, just privatizing Social Security. Right? And the word privatizing and private accounts sound similar, so Democrats were using that a lot. Republicans were talking about the death tax and illegal aliens. Okay, so this is kind of a neat use of raw data to actually tell us what is partisan speech, and then they applied it to how the media report the news. Okay. The first paper. A second question economists are really concerned about is the idea of voter persuasion. And we actually use the term, we're not afraid of using it, we call this the Fox News effect. Right here. Okay? So there's actually two different papers that have different ways of getting at this. So the problem, of course, right, as if you were in the social media lecture earlier, you heard the speaker talk about correlational studies. We don't want correlation here. We want to know the causal effect of Fox News on voting patterns. Okay, well, there's two different papers that took two different approaches to solving this. I want to describe them quickly and tell you what they found. So the first, Delavine and Kaplan. What they noticed is that so Fox News launched in the late 90s. The motto was fair and balanced. That lasted about 6 months, and then they kind of started to sound a lot more Republican. Turns out different cable systems added Fox News to their cable system at different times. So basically the Lancaster cable system may have gotten it before the Harrisburg one. So the idea is, why don't we look at how votes look in that gap between the time that it gets added to the Harrisburg cable system as well. Okay, so that's their idea. And they actually did find that if you were exposed to Fox News, if Fox News was available in your market, then actually you were more likely to vote Republican. And the magnitude was enough to swing elections. I thought it was actually pretty significant. So a couple other authors, Martin and Yoropoglou, came along and said, we don't like this because we think that cable system in Lancaster picked up Fox News before the other one because people wanted Fox News more in Lancaster. Okay? And so they have a different strategy. The happy ending here is they end up finding very similar results, but a different way. So what they did is they looked at what channel number is Fox News on your cable system. So it turns out you watch the channels that are in the lower numbers. And it's actually an amazing relationship. When you look at even the difference between being on 10 and 11 is actually significant. So they said, okay, well, people who have Fox News on a lower numbered channel on their cable system are more likely to watch Fox News. Let's see if areas that have Fox News on lower numbered channels vote more Republican. And they actually found results that were very consistent with the earlier one. So they found as well that actually you could tip elections with the Fox News effect. Okay, so it's a second question that economists have been looking at. A third question economists are looking at is the idea of voter turnout. Okay, maybe it's not about convincing people to go and vote for a particular candidate. Maybe it's about telling people, hey, you should go and vote. Right? It's worth the cost to you. So a first paper in this area, Jensen 2006, looks at the effect of television on voter turnout and finds that turnout decreased when an area got TV. Okay, and there's no mechanism suggested in that paper, although the hypothesis put forward is that people stopped reading newspapers and started watching I Love Lucy. Okay, and if that happens, you might expect them to be less engaged in democracy. Okay, that was kind of a concern. And then I have a paper with a couple of co-authors where we look at the effect of newspaper circulation directly on voter turnout. And here's what we do. We gathered the universe of daily newspapers in the US from 1869 to today. Okay, and we looked at their circulation. What we wanted to know was, how does circulation affect turnout? And again, we don't want correlations, we want causation, right? So how do we attack this problem? We noticed the following fact. When a newspaper is operating, it kind of grows in circulation. If it's going to die at some point, it kind of peters out and then just goes to zero. It exits right away, while people were still kind of subscribing and reading it. So we look at the very next election after one of these hard exits, because it's like a shock, it's a negative shock to people reading newspapers in this market. And what we found is, yeah, it turns out that yes, people don't vote as much when that happens. When their newspaper they were subscribing to shuts down, they're less likely to vote in the next election. Again, we're looking primarily in that paper on voting for president and for Congress. Of course, we had this really long panel. It would be silly of us not to exploit the fact that we have all these different historical eras. So we estimate this effect on turnout, and we find it's really big historically, and it's just going down over time. And that's consistent with the idea of, well, if my newspaper shuts down today, I have lots of other sources of information, right? Whereas 50 years ago, 100 years ago, I had fewer alternatives that I could appeal to get information about elections. Okay, so these are the three kind of big facts that have been established. We have clear links between what the news media is doing and what's happening in our elections. And we also know that people like to read news that they agree with. Okay? This could be a tricky combination, right? Because this could lead to problems like we're seeing today, where people are in news bubbles, only consuming the news they want. And it could actually reinforce itself by convincing you to go and vote for that issue, and so on. Okay, so this raises a tough question. However, the evidence of what's going on behind the scenes, why does the newspaper make me go and vote? Why does Fox News make me go and vote Republican? Well, I wouldn't even have a guess, but why does this happen? That's mostly suggestive so far. And so I want to talk about some research I'm working on to try and get at this better. So this is a paper that is joint with a couple of co-authors, one at Columbia, one at Sciences Po in Paris. And we were motivated by this question of, we're losing our local newspapers. There's an epidemic of newspaper closings across the US. Well, there are two big challenges in studying this problem. First, newspapers operate what we call a two-sided market, which I'll explain in a second. And second, newspapers are really offering a bundle of goods, right? They're offering you local news, national news, sports, weather, horoscope, classifieds. We want to understand how that might be changing over time as you see kind of new technologies enter. So in respect to a two-sided market, what do I mean by a two-sided market? I mean that newspapers really produce two different things, right? They produce this content that they sell to readers, and they sell advertising to advertisers. And we can't ignore these two things. They actually depend on one another, right? The amount I can make in the advertising market depends on how many people are reading my newspaper. That's why it's what we call a two-sided market. You have to take both sides of the market into account. So what we want to do in this project is try to understand how the newspaper business model of doing this, selling a bundle of things to readers, selling their attention to advertisers, how does that react to the entry of a new technology? So how do incumbent local news outlets respond and adapt to new technology, and how does the bundle they sell change? And the context we're going to use is going to be historical for a few reasons. One, we have great data. Two, we have a great experiment, so a natural experiment, we can exploit the data. But what we're going to do is look at exactly how, when television was introduced in the US, newspapers responded. How did that business model change? So I can look at things like prices and quantities in the readership market and in the advertising market, and I can also look at how the bundle, the newspaper bundle, evolved when TV was introduced. Okay? So some people say, what's the big deal about a local newspaper going out of business? Who cares about the information they're providing? Economists actually think local news is critical to the functioning of democracy. Right? We think this is the check on your local government to making sure they're doing the right thing. The local news press is how you get essential information about your locality as opposed to the nation as a whole. So I have kind of an interesting example. This is the Orlando Reporter-Star. This is their cover page from August 6, 1945. Atomic bomb hits Japan and lake swimming called dangerous. As you can see, it's a bundle. You're getting your national news, you're getting your local news. Okay? And you're getting a bunch of other things too. But really, television is a national idea. Right? Only recently did television news become an important big thing at the local level. Television is really about the big issues that affect everyone. Local newspapers, though, are important. This is, I have an example here just up the road. In 2012, it was the Harrisburg Patriot News that won the Pulitzer Prize. They're reporting on the Penn State scandal. Okay, so if you don't have a local newspaper, you don't have scandals being uncovered, and you don't know that it's not safe to swim in the lake. Okay? So, we think local news is an important thing to study. So how do we approach this? How do we actually answer this question? Well, we gathered a ton of data. So there's this primary data source we use called the Editor and Publisher International Yearbook. Your library probably has copies from some years. Okay, it's a big directory of every newspaper in the US. So this is just the first page from 1954. So I apologize, it's a little hard to read, but each kind of entry here is a newspaper. This is Alabama, so this is the Decatur Daily Newspaper. This is the Dothan Eagle. I see the circulation, I see the subscription price, I see the advertising price. Okay, so this is really rich data from an economics point of view. We actually digitized this. So we see circulation, circulation price, advertising rates, basic characteristics. We digitized this, it took a long time. But we actually entered all this data, so we had a database of every single US newspaper. Okay? Oh, I should mention too, if you're a newspaper, you want your listing to be correct in this, because this is what Sears Roebuck was using to figure out where to place our ads. So you want all your information to be correct. So we think we can trust this data. We augment this with a second massive data set, which is basically advertising quantities. How many lines of advertising did you sell in a year? So if I look at this, I can look up my Alabama example, the Decatur Daily or the Dothan Eagle. I can see how much total advertising lines we sold. And it's actually broken out. Was the advertiser national or local? Was it classified? Was it legal? So I know something about the different types of advertising you're selling. Okay? So we gathered this absolutely massive data set. We digitized all the years that we could get, which was 1946 to 1965. Okay, so this is really rich data from the econ point of view, right? We've got prices and quantities for a bunch of different markets. Okay, so what are we going to do? How are we going to measure this? Let me tell you a bit about the history of television. It's not as straightforward as you might think. The first license for commercial broadcasting was July 1941. What started at the end of 1941? World War II, right? So TV kind of started and then stopped right away, went off the air. But it was adopted very quickly. By 1960, we were all pretty much addicted to TV in the way that we're addicted to social media and other things now, right? TV stations were affiliated with networks. It was very expensive to produce TV content in this time period. So you tended to be associated with a network, the Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC. And you would provide that national content. And importantly, advertising is also very different. You were not seeing TV ads for the car dealership around the corner, right? Because it was so expensive, all you saw was sponsored programming. So you'd watch a game show or something, at the end, the host would walk over to a stove and say, this is a great Kenmore stove, you should really consider buying this. Or some people will come out and start singing a jingle for Maxwell House Coffee and how great it is, right? So that's what advertising means on TV during this time period. In terms of news, there was not a ton of news on TV, but it did exist in the evening. Go on YouTube and watch what the news used to look like during this era. It was typically an old white guy sitting at a table, smoking a cigarette, and reading news to you. That is what the news was at the beginning of TV. So it's changed a wee bit. Here's the trick. This is what we want to use to actually identify what's going on to newspapers during this time period. So the FCC, this is the Federal Communications Commission, so this is the regulator. They froze the licensing of new TV stations in 1948. So basically they said, stop, we're not issuing any more licenses. And then they waited for about 4 years before accepting new licenses. So we have this freeze. So there's a number of years there where TV exists in some markets and not in others. okay, well, this is really useful for us because I can just compare the newspapers in the markets that got TV to the newspapers in the markets that didn't get TV. Okay, so that's our identification strategy. If you're an econ student, you may have heard the term difference in difference. That's the research design that we're thinking of here. Okay, so a few more details. As I said, there was a first interruption to TV in World War II. It was considered unpatriotic to do anything that wasn't supporting the war effort, so we didn't have any TV broadcasts those years. And then we started issuing licenses. I'll show you how this rolls out, but then there was this freeze, and it was actually due to engineering problems. We, as humanity, had not solved the problem of electromagnetic interference. So we were granting TV licenses. They would start broadcasting, and then they would interfere. People would just get noise. So that was the problem. That's why they did the freeze. So what we're going to do is just mostly focus on the markets that were kind of granted a license right before or right after the freeze, arguing they should be otherwise equal. And I'll show you a list of those cities in a second. So where do we get all our TV data from? This is another directory we had to digitize, although it was much easier, thank goodness. But this is basically every TV station in the country at this time period. So I pulled up one for Mobile, Alabama, and one for Birmingham. These are the first TV stations in those two markets. What's really important, there's tons of interesting little details here. I don't care about most of it. What I really care about is there's the date of began operations. So Mobile here is 1953. They're after the freeze. Okay, so they did not have TV in those intervening years. Whereas Birmingham, the date, began operations was 49. So again, how's the newspaper in Birmingham doing relative to the newspaper in Mobile? Okay? So this is the idea that we're going to use. So let me show you some pictures of how TV evolved in the US. So it should be no surprise, the first markets with TV licenses were New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. Okay, that makes sense, right? You're going to go where the biggest markets are first. So these maps, I'm going to show you one for each year. I'm going to roll the years forward. This is 1945. Every little red dot is a media market. Once it gets TV broadcasts, it becomes big. Okay, so it's like TV is turned on. So as I flip forward, here's 46, here's 47, here's 48. This is the year we start the freeze. We say we're not granting any more licenses, but if we've already given you a license and you just haven't started yet, you can use it. So we'll see a little bit more opening as we go forward. So here's 49, here's 50. And then as I flip from 50 to 51, you'll see exactly zero change. This is when the freeze is really in strong effect. Right, so if I flip to 51, boom, nothing changed. So this is the variation we're going to use. We're going to use the fact that Birmingham, Alabama has TV, it has a large red dot. Mobile, Alabama does not. It has a small red dot. Okay? So this is our identification strategy. In 52, we stopped the freeze. We started licensing TV again, so we see some kind of growth. And then the floodgates opened in 1953. Turns out that everyone really likes watching TV, so it basically spread quite quickly across the rest of the country. As by the mid-50s, even the smallest markets in North Dakota have TV stations. Okay, so there's that. So that's the general idea. We're going to do that comparison. How do newspapers fare? I told you I'd show you the list of free cities. So if you want to believe our results, you have to believe it's legit to compare newspapers in the left markets to the newspapers in the right markets. The ones on the left are the ones that got TV before the freeze. The ones on the right are the ones that got TV after the freeze. So in particular, let's take some examples. It has to be the case that Johnstown and Binghamton, Utica are good comparison groups for Youngstown, Wilkes-Barre, and South Bend. Okay? Seems like those are not crazy control groups for one another. It seems they're otherwise pretty similar markets. Okay, so just I need you to believe that those are good treatment control groups in order for you to believe our analysis. I will mention, in case you've heard of this in an econ class, we also do what's called a matching estimator just to be double sure of what we're doing, and we get similar or even stronger results usually. Okay, so let me tell you what we got. So first of all, the readership market. Think about newspaper circulation. Well, what should we expect to happen? What do you think is going to happen when there was a newspaper market and a TV station starts operating? Yeah, go for it.
Less readership.
Why?
I guess it's more convenient to just watch TV.
Okay, so you're gonna substitute what you're saying. You think TV's a substitute. So in principle, TV can be a substitute. It can also be the case though, right, that I watch the evening news on TV and then decide, oh, I want to read more about that. I go out and buy the newspaper. That would make them complements. Right? So ex ante, I think it's It could be either way, but I think your intuition was bang on, and our sense was they were going to be substitutes. And that is what we found. So these are regressions, right? I'm showing you some coefficients on a dummy for do you have TV or not using this sample of cities. And what we get is the following. We get a no significant effect on subscription price. Why do you think that might be? We weren't adjusting the prices. We were kind of surprised by that, and then we realized the modal price of a newspaper was 5 cents. So to change your price meant to go 4 or 6, which is like a 20% swing. So we think that's why we're not seeing any effect there. But what we do see is exactly a drop in circulation, about 3%. Okay, and if you look at revenue as a whole for the circulation market, down about 4.5%. Okay, so the net effect here, no result on prices, but circulation falls and revenue falls. So what the implication here is that television is a substitute among readers, exactly as we heard from third row. Okay, let's go to the other side of the market, the advertising side. What do you think is going to happen on the advertising side of the market? It's the same logic, right? It could be a substitute. I could switch my advertising away from newspaper TV, or I want to sponsor a program on TV and have people read more details in my ad in the newspaper. So it's ex ante ambiguous, but I think if your prior was the same as mine, you're like, it's going to be a substitute probably. And so if we do the numbers, that's actually what we get. We get the idea that the price does change for advertising. That makes sense though, because you have fewer readers. It's kind of hard to charge the same price when you have fewer readers, right? So we see the price fall a little bit. The total ad line, just like the quantity of ads sold, goes down by about 3%. Revenue from advertising falls on the order of 4%. So just like on the other side, it looks like television is a substitute among advertisers. Okay? So this is kind of the main picture. We know what happened here so far. We had our newspapers. They were operating in two-sided markets. Television comes in, it's a negative shock on both sides. Turns out not all newspapers are equal, though, in this effect. So let's think about which types of newspapers are most likely to be hit more by television. So the first thing we looked at, this was not the case today, but there used to be a lot of evening newspapers. Right? The paper would be the Lancaster Evening News. And what that meant is they actually produced an edition around 3 p.m., distributed around 4 or 5 p.m. It was an evening newspaper meant to be consumed in the evening. That's in contrast to the morning newspapers that were distributed at 7 a.m. Well, we can break up our sample by morning versus evening. And it turns out really the main effect is the evening newspapers. Most of them were, most of these were evening newspapers, and they were the ones that saw the most kind of pain from the entry of TV. Seems to make sense though, right? Because if there's really not much TV programming on in the morning, I'm probably going to substitute my evening TV or newspaper reading, with TV viewing. Surprisingly, if anything, we do see a slight positive effect for morning newspapers. It's not statistically significant, but we were just surprised. Maybe that story about watching the evening news and then wanting to read more in the morning actually makes sense. The second thing we looked at was local versus national advertisers. What luck that our raw data broke out local advertisers versus national advertisers in newspapers. Well, again, as you'd expect here, since television is a technology more suited to national advertising, right? I can't really do a local store's ad on TV at this point in time. While the local advertisers didn't change what they were doing, it was the national advertisers who moved away from newspapers and towards TV. And so overall, in equilibrium, what we expect to happen is, and what we see, we can't show statistically, but evening newspapers were more likely to exit, basically, right? Or convert to a morning format. It was considered more expensive to be a morning newspaper than an evening newspaper. It's easier to get people who want to work during the day than work overnight, right? So what we see is it's kind of consistent with what we've seen over time, which is now it's predominantly morning newspapers. There's very few evening newspapers. Okay, so we then wanted to go deeper, and we decided to go look at the content of the newspaper itself. As I told you, the newspaper is a bundle. Local news, national news, horoscope, weather, classifieds, etc., comics. So we actually have about a terabyte of data that is full issues of local newspapers from this era. And we didn't really want to read them ourselves, so we had RAs read a lot of them for us. That was key. And they coded up things like how much of this is local versus national content. But then we also found the perfect RA, which is a machine. It turns out machines can read the newspaper for you. So we actually wrote machine learning code to go through the paper and try to figure out how much content is there in here. How much of this newspaper is not pictures, not headlines, not ads. And And so we use some kind of computer science techniques to actually measure this, right? The computer can look at this and tell me, give me a score of how much of this is not photos, headlines, or ads. Okay, this is very time intensive. It turns out, this RA doesn't complain at all, but it just takes a long time to do. But we have done it for a large number of papers at this point, and we end up getting, this is the 16 pages of the Altoona Mirror from one day in 1947. Okay, we actually come up with a score of how much stuff is in the newspaper. All right, so we can use this and now answer the bigger question of how does that bundle change now that TV has appeared in your market? We know you're kind of hurting in both the readership side and the ad side. How do you adjust that bundle? Okay? Now again, what should we expect here? How do you think the bundle might change if TV all of a sudden pops up in your neighborhood? So our prior was that, well, since TV is mostly national news, it's national things, maybe, economic concept of differentiation, we should see the local newspapers, really focus on local news, really do a kind of deep dive of local. That is not what we are going to see. This was actually the biggest surprise to us in this study. So our guess was you're going to see newspapers specialize in the local topic. It's all about the lake swimming could be dangerous, right? Making that the kind of focus of the paper. But we didn't, when we were thinking that, we neglected to look at the fact that you can change the length of the newspaper, right? You can give more of everything or less of everything. It's not it must sum to this number of pages, okay? And so that's what we end up finding. And in fact, what we get is we get less of everything. So national news goes down, local news goes down. The share of local news goes up slightly, but not enough to kind of fully compensate. So what we actually see is after the shock, you're losing advertising revenue, you're losing circulation revenue. It's not like you double down on local news, you provide less of everything. This has some kind of implications for today, right? Because what's happened with the internet, it's basically been attacking that bundle of the newspaper, chipping away at it piece by piece. Where do you get your weather news from right now? Your front screen of your phone, right? Which is probably either powered by weather.com or AccuWeather or something. Where do you get your sports information from? ESPN or something like that, right? So what the internet has done is it's really attacked the bundle. And every time you attack the bundle here, you make it less valuable to provide some of everything. And so you get more and more retrenchment. Okay, and we have in the paper an actual theory model of this. And of course, everyone's familiar with Craigslist, right? There are no classified ads really anymore in newspapers, or very little. There's much less revenue. So as the newspaper bundle has been attacked more and more, we shouldn't see them necessarily double down on local news. They might just do less of everything. Okay, and that was kind of one of our big findings in this study. Okay? So, I wanted to summarize this paper. The entry of TV was a big shock to newspapers. No surprise there. It was a big negative shock, though, on both sides. The story of it being a compliment doesn't seem to really carry anywhere. Okay? But the response of newspapers was actually to cut back on what they were offering. And it's possible there are cost reasons for doing that as well. But what we saw is less of everything once you have this negative shock to both sides of the market. Okay? So as the internet continues to unbundle our newspaper, it gets harder and harder to kind of survive in the classic newspaper business model. That's why I was really happy to see this. If you were at the very first session yesterday, we had a speaker from this thing called The Caucus, which is about a year and a half old. It's local news. It's trying to bring back that one element of the bundle that we've seen cut back so hard. It's investigative journalism based in Harrisburg, in the state capital, at the legislature. And they try and do the kind of real local news reporting that has been cut back from every local newspaper. Okay? I wanted to reach out to this person after their talk and ask them what are the economics of this, how is this doing? But unfortunately she had to run, so I didn't get to ask her. But this is, this was a reassuring thing that someone's actually investing in trying to do the local information provision that seems to be disappearing. Okay? So the last thing I want to talk about is some new data I've been gathering for a new project. So I'm going to show you a pretty startling fact. I should mention this is joint with a few of the co-authors at Stanford, Brown, and Chicago. I want to give you a motivating fact, and it might actually be demotivating in some sense, because this is an annual index of employment for newspaper publishers from 2000 to today. Okay, it's one of those things where you almost don't need the y-axis to tell what's going on here, right? So it's an index. It's indexed to 2007. We have about half as many people employed in newspapers today as were in 2007, and it's about a third as many as we had in 2000. Okay, so this study was motivated by a very different industry. There's a very common anecdote told in economics, which is that we produce in the US the same amount of steel we produced 30 years ago. We just do it with way fewer people. Okay? Individual people are far more productive. Our question is, okay, we have fewer journalists here. Could we be producing as much news as we were before, as much content? The thinking is, right, think about it, if you're a journalist today, you've got a smartphone, right? You've got the internet wherever you go. Maybe journalists are way more productive today. And so maybe this isn't as scary from a society's point of view as it kind of looks right here. So that was our motivating question. We wanted to answer, like, how productive are journalists? Is the news media? So you're probably noticing a trend. We went and got some data. Okay, so we found a press association. So this is like an industry trade group that had hundreds of members. Every year would send their members a questionnaire and say, tell me how many journalists you have, what your salaries are for them, how many ad reps you have, what the salaries are, how much newsprint do you use, how much paper did you use, what's your circulation? Give us all your info, okay? And why would you do this? Why would you answer this questionnaire? It's because they would take all the questionnaires in and then do benchmarks and say, oh, it looks like you're overspending on this or that or the next thing. So it's again, your incentive to tell the truth here. So we got the raw data. We got the actual questionnaires basically. And so we now see for a large panel of hundreds of newspapers per year, well over 100 production variables. How many journalists, et cetera? How much newsprint are you using? Okay, and so we call these in economics things like inputs and outputs. Right? So the inputs are those journalists, salaries, commodities, whereas the outputs are, well, how many issues are you selling? How much ad revenue are you making, or how much ad lineage are you inserting? So we're digitizing all of this. The goal is to figure out how productive is that journalist in your organization in terms of those outputs. So what I'm going to show you in the next few slides is just some really simple raw data plots, more or less. So if you're an econ student, this would be described as a panel data set, right? Because we see the same newspaper every year reporting new things. So it's a panel, and so what we do is we run what's called a two-way fixed effect regression model, where we take out newspaper fixed effects and year fixed effects. Then I'm going to plot the year fixed effects to give you time trends. Okay, so I'm going to display, taking out the newspaper kind of characteristics, what does the mean look like for each year for some of these variables. So it makes it really easy to look at things like for circulation, this is the pattern we observe kind of in the raw data. It's clearly increasing for a while, and then it kind of flattens out. And just to clarify, the flatten out part is where people have been saying there's a crisis in local newspapers. Right? But it's not that bad. People are still subscribing to newspapers. Want to raise your hand if you subscribe to a paper edition of a newspaper? Okay, 4. All right, it's something. People are still subscribing to paper newspapers, though. It's still happening. Let me show you, though, a different graph, right? As I said, this is a two-sided market. So this is circulation revenue. Let's look at advertising revenue. I wonder what that did. So here's where we see the crisis starting to manifest itself, right? If I plot these year fixed effects, it's increasing, and then a big decrease. In percent terms, that's like 30 or 40%. Okay, so what we've seen is a huge drop-off in the advertising revenue of newspapers. So how does that manifest itself? Imagine you're an editor, you're running a newspaper, you have a newsroom, and you have an advertising room, or an advertising sales room. And the advertising sales room says, we're losing 30% of our revenue. Who do you let go? Well, it's kind of in line with our earlier story, it's everyone. So here's news and editorial salaries and advertising department salaries for the same time series. What you see is they got rid of both. It's not like because circulation is doing fine, they kept all of everyone in the newsroom. Actually, they increased salaries or they fired people on both sides of the market. Okay, so the shock was to advertising revenue, but both sides are really seeing big cuts here. Okay? So I'm going to leave you with slightly not so great news, which is this picture. This is the pages of news produced by our newspaper panel over time. And what you can see is in just raw terms, this crisis era looks bad. It looks like we are actually producing less news. Okay, so this is kind of the crisis as we see it. We might not be getting actually all the information we used to get, even though we have fewer people. It might not be the case that journalists have become that much more productive to make up for the loss in numbers. And so this is a huge concern. So I want to wrap up my kind of prepared comments just summarizing this, and then I'll accept some questions. But the idea here is that economists have studied this a lot. We really care about the news media. We're really interested in how the media interacts with democracy. And we've learned a lot, right? We know that people like news they agree with. We know that the news media can make people vote and even influence who they vote for. So we're trying to add more mechanisms, but the press has an important role in democracy. A real issue going forward is that the traditional business model of like a newspaper is not doing too well in today's economy. All right, I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, please.
So let's say like a paper came to you guys and asked like, how could you fix our problem? What would you say to them?
And that is the $1 million question. Okay, so this is why I want to understand what these people are doing. Because this is actually, what's the Lancaster News Press or something?
LNP.
LNP. LNP actually is funding this right now. I don't know if they're making money on this right now. And I don't know how long LNP will keep funding this if it's not making money. Right? Because the trick is, even if you launch this, it's not like you're going to get your peak subscription right away. It takes a while to build up a subscriber base. Right? So you might be losing money for years before you turn a profit on something like this. I have talked to editors of newspapers about what they're doing. The editor of the San Diego Union Tribune told me he was doubling down on local news. They were going to produce a newspaper that had like sections for each neighborhood of the community and actually really try and double down on that. He was very optimistic about the product. He was very worried about monetizing it because he said, okay, I think this is valuable. I think people like it. Will people pay enough to actually support this? That was unclear. So I think you're seeing experimentation. If you're the New York Times, you can build a paywall, right? If you're the Lancaster paper, it's a bit harder to monetize that. Yes, please.
Do you think in the future we can see from television to even social media take over just because so many people already have access and they might get rid of their cable or opt out for it and then move to social media?
I think that's great. The concern I have is the quality of the reporting, right? It turns out it's expensive to have an investigative journalist team actually, uncover scandals and do deep dives into what Congress is spending, our money on. So it's hard to imagine that social media is ever going to actually replace, Deep Throat, who topple the president, right? Like that generally tends to happen in newspapers and professional organizations that are investing in this. I think dissemination through social media is fine. Getting the word out is one thing. But if there's no business model, no economic model to actually rationalize spending a lot of money on collecting news, it's not clear how it's going to work. Because if I started a news channel on Snapchat, how much money could I make?
Well, are you familiar? NBC did actually start that. They started staging it on Snapchat, and it is backed by NBC. They pay the reporters. They send them out to do, and they mostly cover the same overlapping things if you watch them in the news. But they are just trying to get that target of younger generation or people who aren't watching TV at that 6:30 time. So they're watching it when they're on the go.
So it sounds like a great experiment they're doing, but I'll go back to the quality issue because again, I think you don't. Yes, it's true there are some very good television journalists who do the equivalent of long-form journalism and actually do kind of the investigative work, but traditionally that hasn't been the case, and especially at the local level, right? So NBC nationally might be able to do some interesting, very good work and disseminate it by Snapchat and try and engage a younger audience. But can the local NBC affiliate do that?
As of right now, it's just it's like a correspondent to the nightly news, and they do bring on the nightly news correspondent. So right now it's just that, and I don't know. That might be a good question for that.
That's my concern is we're losing that local edge, and I don't know that the Snapchat model can necessarily fix it. Necessarily.
Would you take into consideration sponsored content with your data?
There's not on which part of it.
For
Like BuzzFeed?
any of your.
I have not done much with data advertising or sponsored content like BuzzFeed. If you have in mind where
Yeah.
they don't tell you, but it's actually an ad.
Yeah, or like in Netflix, I went to an earlier seminar and they said that Netflix puts out a lot of sponsored content, but then they'll have it at the bottom, but sometimes it's not as big, not just for Netflix, but for other companies. It's not as big, so people think that those articles are real news.
Yeah, this is very controversial. So Instagram has gotten in trouble over this, right? Because you're supposed to disclose if you're being paid to promote something by law. And how many Instagram influencers actually disclose that? It's very few. once in a while you'll see paid partnership between so and so and so and so. I have seen many clear ads on Instagram that are not in any way disclosed. And famously, Kim Kardashian got in trouble for this because she promoted a drug, which since I've reached on drug advertising, she promoted a drug for when you're pregnant. I forget the exact details. But she promoted it and got in trouble with the FDA. So it's a gray zone, I would say. I think a lot of people in the academic world don't like sponsored content because they think it's partially deceptive. That's not the goal. But I agree, it's where firms are moving because they're having trouble engaging. No one clicks on banner ads, as we've heard from a few talks, right? Like, banner ads don't really work. Native advertising tends to work better. So we shouldn't be surprised if firms are experimenting. But not my favorite idea going forward. And I have not taken it into account. I don't know, there's very little data available on it. As you've seen, right, I like to have data to answer these questions. Yeah. Yes, please.
Have you noticed any with, like, of course you said you were wondering if the local would get cut down, but everything would get cut down?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that the quality or even the media literacy or the attempt to give the audience an informed, literate,
Yeah.
like, information has also gone down?
That's one of the questions we want to answer in this paper, in this project. So it's really hard to figure that out because think of the following, right? Like, there are surveys every year, like, did you hear about this scandal or that scandal? The problem is each scandal has an idiosyncratic level of kind of noteworthiness. So it's really hard over time to figure out, like, are people more well-informed now or then? Because the things to be informed about have changed. So we want to answer that question, and we've thought a lot about how to do it because we want to be able to try and kind of infer something about, this picture. We don't have an answer to it. If you have any great ideas of how to measure that, that would be great. Our best idea so far is like how much information is produced about natural disasters. The reason being is because those occur randomly, right? You can't kind of get ready for it or something. So in some sense, we should be able to see how much content is being produced by studying something like that that's unpredictable. Okay.
I wonder about kind of unbundling local and national. I wonder if people are unbundling the way we say consume news itself, but rather than a story coming in one solid piece, you're going to Twitter, you're going to Instagram, you're going to online source, you're piecing together kind of narrative. It's unbundled. So the idea that the story is contained in a news, a single author journalistic account by an author might be something that is unbundled.
That's a good point.
It happens across media.
It's a good point, and we probably consume many more sources of media than we ever did before. We have more available to us. If anything, based on the keynote last night, it might be good if people are getting multiple viewpoints on issues as opposed to just one. So I'm not sure it's a bad thing, but I agree it's happening. People are consuming news from lots of different sources.
Great.
I mean, hopefully, though, people take into account the source. This is the one thing that, being a literate consumer of media, you need to understand the incentives of the other side. And the thing that drives me nuts is that there's a profit incentive behind fake news, right? That you can make a lot of money from fake news. So make sure when you're getting more and more sources, you know what those sources are and what their intentions are. But I think, of course, it's happening. Yeah, please.
Kind of with the same, like, make sure that you know what you're reading or watching. So with also like the Snapchat, so like I used to watch like ESPN, but now ESPN has just a short overview of the past day on Snapchat, so it's much easier. So like, what do you think for like just like news companies that do try to do things like that, and like obviously they can't localize that, but like what do you think they could try to do possibly?
Yeah, I think ESPN's a funny case because they're kind of experimenting with a lot of new things right now because they fired half their sports center. And so people don't want to tune into Sports Center anymore. Their business model is also kind of broken in a different way.
That's what it is. It's Sports Center now. So like, I don't even see Sports Center on TV anymore. Like, I don't bother trying to sit down and watch it. I just go on my phone and just quick watch the 5 minutes that is there, and then I get everything I would have gotten in half an hour.
Yeah, people. Yes. So ESPN is trying to find a new business model where at one point they were losing 10,000 subscribers a day. I live in Connecticut. It's based there, so we hear a lot about this. But they try to do the ESPN Go thing. They're trying to do a whole bunch of different approaches because they don't know what to do. And they used to have a really nice business model that just kind of printed money, and then everyone said, that's not going to do it anymore. I'm not interested. I don't need to pay for this, so I don't need to kind of sit at this time and watch this. Right? SportsCenter was easy to produce too. It was very cheap. Whereas the content of the games are super expensive, right? And they have gotten more expensive. So that's why they're trying to find new ways to monetize it. My guess is they're just experimenting on Snapchat. They probably don't have like too much of a long-term plan at this point. Yeah.
Do you have an estimate on how many local papers have been shut down?
Shoot, I have the number. I don't have it off the top of my head. It's hundreds, though. I mean, so yeah, I would say since 1950, around 700 local newspapers shut down. It's a huge number. And a lot of others, if they're not shutting down, they're switching format from say 5, 6, or 7 days a week to fewer days per week. So you have some like 3-day-a-week papers that used to be daily.
So they're not even switching into digital, they're just canceling.
That's also happening. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer just switched. They shut down the paper side and just did online only. They did that though in 2012. It was much harder to monetize the online side. I think it's getting easier to monetize the online side. People are somewhat getting used to the idea of paying money for news, whereas no one was willing to do that in say 2012. All right, one more.
When you were analyzing the amount of content
Yeah.
in the newspaper, did you look at what the actual content was during that? Was there a decrease in newspaper sales and whether we had newspapers started reporting more along the lines of fear-mongering?
So we did look at that. I mean, this era, it's less of an issue, I think, the fear-mongering. We read, a large team of RAs read the articles and categorized them. Was it because we were actually initially thinking, are they going to use more wire service stories? Right, you could use Associated Press instead of having your actual reporter do it. So we did read for certain things, but we didn't look at things specifically like the tone of the language used. Did they actually go more kind of negative on certain topics or start editorializing? That's not a part of the main project, but it's today definitely relevant.
I know with Lancaster there used to be 2 newspapers,
Yeah.
one evening, one was conservative, one
Yep.
was rather liberal. Of the remaining ones that haven't shut down, is there any look as to which side they lean more partisan towards of the remaining groups of newspapers?
Yeah, so I wrote a paper on this 10 years ago. I'm trying to remember, it's probably a little out of date because of that, but interestingly, they tend to skew Republicans slightly on me. And it's only because it's correlated with income. And so that's what tends to happen.
The ones that drop or
No, the ones that remain. All else equal, but this is one of these all else equal things. In terms of raw numbers, it's actually more Democrat papers because there are more Democrats in the country. But if you do the regression, you control for everything, you're more likely to be a Republican paper, just because that ends up being more profitable. I wish I had the current data. I mean, I did this analysis a while ago, but yeah. It's an interesting question. We actually really tried to understand how a paper positions itself in the market. And when you have 2, it's pretty natural that one will kind of cater one way, one will go the other. When you have 1, they should kind of hit the center. Right? The problem is now there's so many online alternatives that if you go to the center, you're gonna lose the edges, right? So I think we're out of time.
So thanks everybody for coming and thank you, Mark.